this spectacular pastoral setting, one would not imagine that this was once a strategic location, so much so that it was a site of numerous wars and bloodshed. Once called the Rose of the Jordan, Shoshanat Hayarden, Mishmar Hayarden lasted almost 60 years as a modern settlement until it was destroyed in 1948 and lay in ruins. Today there are remnants of what had been and a memorial to those who sacrificed in a futile attempt to stave off the Syrians in the Israeli War of Independence. This fierce and brave battle, fought by the few against the many, prevented an Assyrian onslaught against the entire Galilee in the newly formed state. 3 important days in a fierce but relatively unknown battle helped determine the border of Israel. Location is everything, so they say, and that was most certainly true here. Mishmar Hayarden is situated 5 kilometers from the Benot Ya'akov bridge. This bridge crosses the natural ford of the Jordan River, connecting the Galilee to the Golan Heights, making it strategically important all the way since the days of the ancient empires of the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, and the Syrians. It was one of the few crossings connecting these ancient empires. It connected the major trade route from Akko to Damascus. The Romans included it in their route known as the Via Maris. Saladin fought a tremendous battle here against the Crusaders, crushing them. Remains from many of these time periods still exist. The Benot Ya'akov Bridge continued in importance, marking the northernmost point of Napoleon's campaigns, and it was here where the British battled against the Turks during World War I. This bridge was blown up by the Haganah against the British in 1946, and finally, the Syrians crossed this bridge in 1948 with their tanks, artillery, and massive number of soldiers against the newly declared State of Israel and directly to Mishmar Hayarden. Back in 1884, with the beginning of the renewal of Zionism and with the first Aliyah movement, a new farm had its roots. Mordechai Labarsky thought this area was perfect and the most exquisite land to develop into a farm. He called it the Rose of the Jordan, Shoshanat Hayarden, and he and his 2 sons attempted to make a go of it. Unfortunately, after a number of years, they realized it was too difficult to do this alone, and so he leased the land to 20 families from nearby Rosh Pinah. They changed the name to Mishmar Hayarden, meaning Guards of the Jordan, a fitting name since the settlement was first in line right near the Jordan River. Mishmar Hayarden was a moshava, or an agricultural settlement, where everything was privately owned as opposed to a kibbutz. Not many years later, more people joined and the moshava was enlarged. It consisted of a main road with 2 rows of houses facing each other. However, it never grew as large as hoped. Life was hard here and problem plagued this area from the onset. Malaria, a deadly disease and rampant in then Palestine, it affected here as well. Being so isolated, marauders constantly attacked the settlement, and their water source was the Jordan River, 5 kilometers away and 70 meters below. There is no rain here from April till October, so getting water was laborious. Because this settlement was so isolated, travelers passed by infrequently. Only when outsiders came were the settlers able to hear outside news. Eventually, a pumping station was installed on the river, which brought water to the moshav, making life so much easier. By the 1930s, the population was 65. This was the time when the British did not permit immigration, and those wishing to immigrate had to do so illegally. The residents did their part in aiding with the development of the country in any way that they could. Being close to the crossing from Syria, Mishmar Hayarden aided those illegal Iraqi immigrants crossing into the country. When the Arab riots of 1936 to 1939 occurred, terrorism struck here as well, and with it the first casualties. The Arabs blew up the pumping station, forcing the settlers to once again go to the river and physically haul the water. One time, when Chaim Grabowski and his son Menachem were working at the river, Arabs ambushed them, killing them. The settlers needed to be on constant alert, creating double shift work. They were farmers by day and guards at night. A small group of Beitar youths who were associated with the Irgun paramilitary organization reinforced the settlement, but yet the dual shifts of day and night took a heavy toll on the settlers. They requested more reinforcements and the rebuilding of the pump. Reinforcements did not arrive, but eventually electricity was finally brought into this area, years after the rest of the country had been connected. This enabled the reestablishment of the pump and the lighting in the area. These aided to increase security. Real modernization of the Yishuv didn't occur until the 1940s. The donkey route was replaced by a bus route connecting the settlement with the outside. At last, a combine harvested the crops. With these new and modern agricultural methods, the settler began to prosper. With the UN partition vote in November 1947, the security situation deteriorated further. A group of 50 World War II veterans who were known as the Wedgwood Group, who had fought with the Jewish Brigade and were supporters of the Irgun, decided to join Mishmar Hayarden and reinforce the settlers. As the original members of the settlement were not on the same side politically, there were some underlying tensions. However, these were mostly put aside for the greater good. Fish was abundant in the fish ponds, cows provided dairy, wheat and crops were growing abundantly in the fields, but the atmosphere was anything but tranquil. As the weeks passed, shots were fired nightly at the settlement. The water pump was once again blown up, and it was too dangerous to harvest during the day. Mishmar Hayarden was visible to the Syrians, causing all agricultural work to be done at night. As the shells began to fall on the village more frequently, the women and the children were evacuated. As David Ben-Gurion announced the declaration of the state on May 14th, much joy and celebrations occurred throughout the country. But the celebrations were short-lived, as the next day 5 Arab armies were to invade the fledgling nation. The defenders of Mishmar Hayarden understood their precarious situation. They were the front line of the defense for the Galil. The number of defenders and the ammunition was severely lacking. They went to the command post at nearby Rosh Pinah and begged for more arms and manpower. They were promised, but none came. The Syrians, for their part, initially decided not to invade by the Benot Ya'akov bridge. Instead, they attacked south of the Kinneret, the Sea of the Galilee. After some initial successes, they were repulsed at Kibbutz Tiganya. The Syrians retreated, changed commanders, and regrouped. There was going to be a truce as of June 11th, and the Syrians desperately needed a victory for both morale and political reasons. On the morning of June 5th, the Syrians crossed the Benot Ya'akov bridge with 2 battalions, tanks, and artillery. They attacked Mishmar Hayarden, but they were repulsed by the defenders of the Yishuv. Life on the Yishuv moved underground to the basements. The Oded Brigade, under the leadership of Yuri Yafeh, sent some reinforcements. They arrived after the battle and soon left afterwards. The Syrians were full of determination. A win was a must. On the next morning of the 6th, they opened fire again, with heavy assault. The attack was intense. Surrounding settlements heard the battle and sent some reinforcements. Most importantly, the defenders received a 65mm cannon known as the Napoleonchik. This helped repel the attack, and once again the Yishuv was spared. The next 2 days were spent reinforcing defensive positions, gathering unspent bullets and weaponry from the enemy that was left behind, and begging Uri Yafeh, the commander, for more help. Some members of Mishmar Hayarden physically drove down to the command post in Rosh Pinah demanding more reinforcements. They were reassured not to worry. If need be, they would receive it within 10 minutes. That night, sappers arrived to mine the area around Mishmar Hayarden. They succeeded in their task to the south, but when daybreak arrived, they hadn't succeeded mining the north. They were forced to stop, and they were called back. By June 9th, the Syrians realized that the truce was closing in, and a victory was imperative. They doubled down their forces and their efforts in preparing for the final onslaught. That same night turned morning, the High Command finally gave the okay to mine the northern approach to Mishmar Hayarden. But they were delayed, and when they finally arrived, they were bogged down by the immense Syrian attack. They managed to escape, but their failure to mine the north entrance proved fatal. Also that night, one of the Wedgwood soldiers spoke to the commander stating that he had battle experience. The fact that they were still standing was a miracle. To continue against a third attack without serious backing is suicide. If the commander wouldn't give the help that he needed, he was going to go on his own to his Irgun buddies in Haifa. The Irgun agreed to send 50 armed fighters. They traveled as far as Tveria when they were ordered off the bus by the Haganah, and they were not allowed to continue. On the morning of the 10th, a group of 11 defenders arrived at the Yishuv. This brought the total number of defenders to 45. When the Syrians began their third and final assault in the early morning with an intense artillery attack, their attack included 3 infantry battalions, 2 artillery battalions, 20 tanks, and air support, a combined total of 2,500 soldiers. They attacked from the south, the east, and the north. The attack from the south hit the mined area, inflicting damage and a large number of casualties, but it only slowed them down. With the intensity of the attack, many of the defensive positions fell. Communications were severed. Runners couldn't succeed in going between the defenders, and each position was on its own. One by one, the defensive positions fell. Slowly, the defenders retreated to the one main basement. The Syrians gradually encircled the settlement. They went fighting from house to house. Some defense positions managed to hold on a bit longer. A handful of defenders successfully retreated to safety. Karmi Grobowski, whose father and brother were the first victims of terrorism back in the 30s, held his ground. He continuously called to the Syrians in Arabic. They, thinking he was one of them, they would approach only to be mowed down. He repeated this again and again and again. His mother, Rivka, the matriarch of the yeshuv, begged him to seek shelter, but he refused. Karmi believed the commanders who promised that help was on its way. He was determined to hold out until they arrived. However, the help that was promised never arrived, and Karmi died a hero's death. By 1 p.m., Syrian tanks had entered the settlement and were methodically destroying the homes. Slowly, those who could made their way to the main basement. At this point, ammunition was virtually completed, many fighters were wounded, and not many positions remained. At last, the Syrians reached the main bunker. They threw grenades and shot inside. The defenders called out that they wanted to surrender. They sent up someone with a white flag. The Syrians killed him. A second time this happened. At this point, the defenders despaired. A few held on to grenades, which they intended to use against the Syrians if they came inside. Suddenly, the Syrian commander appeared. He was shocked to see survivors, having assumed that they were all killed. The defenders removed their ammunition and proceeded to leave the basement. The Syrian soldiers began to attack the prisoners, but they were stopped by the commander. The Syrians looted whatever they could and then destroyed whatever remained. 60 years of hard labor of building a settlement from scrap, removing stone by stone to prepare the land for agriculture, enduring attacks, isolation, diseases, to finally build a prosperous settlement, all gone. A beautiful crop lay in the field waiting to be harvested, but that was to be done by the enemy. 14 people were killed in this battle. 39 people, including 6 women and 12 wounded, were taken prisoner. The Syrians brought them to Syria for interrogation. They wanted to know where the other fighters were. Where was all the ammunition? They couldn't fathom that this small group of people had held the massive Syrian army off for so many days and had inflicted so much damage and so much losses. The Israelis were held in Syrian prison for 14 months, enduring humiliation and harsh conditions. Finally, after 14 long months, in July 1949, the prisoners were released. After Mishmar Hayarden had been captured, the road to the Galil was open. By bogging down the Syrians in Mishmar Hayarden, the defenders had given the Israelis some time to better organize. The Syrians continued down the main road of the Galil, but they were met by the Oded Brigade. But at this point, the Syrians were tired and they withdrew. They didn't attempt to go any further. Syria succeeded in holding on to a sliver of territory on the western side of the Jordan. The Israelis later tried to recapture this area in Operation Brosh with the secession of the troops, but this was unsuccessful. Syria held on to this territory until the armistice, at which time they withdrew. Would some additional troops and arms turn the tide of the battle and prevented the fall of Mishmar Hayarden? The survivors certainly thought so. Look at the losses they had inflicted on the Syrians with the little they had. Some commanders had thought that the settlement was expendable. Later they admitted that that was a mistake. Syria had gotten their foothold and expanded their territory. The IDF couldn't uproot them, and they suffered heavy losses in the futile attempt. Remember the underlying tensions between the Irgun members and the other settlers? It appears Mishmar Hayarden was politically aligned with the wrong side. There were troops held in reserve. The commander, Uri Yafer, who understood the precariousness of the situation, withheld these troops. He was responsible for the defense of this area, and he was later relieved of his position. Why were the Irgun troops prevented from joining up with their comrades? This chart is evidence that Mishmar Hayarden received fewer arms in their surrounding areas. To add salt to the wounds, you'd have thought that the returning survivors would have received a state hero welcome. The opposite was a reality. When the survivors returned home and wanted to rebuild their farms, they were informed that their land had been confiscated. The compensation for the land, homes, farms, tools, everything that they had owned was pittance. A new moshav named Mishmar Hayarden was established, but this was by newcomers. For almost 30 years, there was no memorial to those who perished. Finally, 30 years later, with a change of government, and Menachem Begin, a former Irgun leader, became the prime minister, an appropriate tribute was established. Today, one can visit the site of the former settlement defended by the few but brave, resilient fighters for the State of Israel.